Alright, so I want to rant about something. It's about creativity and a lack thereof in a lot of professional production companies and that sort of thing. Specifically, I've noticed a kind of a disturbing trend, like a very, well, not disturbing so much as just kind of disappointing. A lot of companies will buy the rights to a very, very big franchise, right? Like a very, very expensive franchise. Like let's say Star Wars, or most recently The Lord of the Rings, right? And yeah, that's great. I mean, it's nice that we can get some content for that sort of thing. But here's where things get a little disappointing. These companies will then put some people in charge who either have never read or never watched, or if they have, they really don't know too much about the franchise or the series or whatever. I know that a lot of Star Wars fans were kind of disappointed with the sequel trilogy, and I know that that's a little mixed, but there's no doubt that a lot of the old canon was just thrown out the window. It was just thrown away completely. Solo, A Star Wars Story, was the very first Star Wars movie ever, so far as I know, to actually lose money. It did not do well. But then, Disney went and turned around and they handed some creative control of Star Wars over to Dave Filoni and Jon Favreau, who are well-known Star Wars fanboys and are behind, or specifically Filoni was behind, such things as the Clone Wars, right? Star Wars The Clone Wars, which a lot of people loved. And then, of course, Jon Favreau's always been a fan of Star Wars. He did a lot of Robot Chicken sketches that had really specific Star Wars references, such as an entire gag with J.R.R. Poof, who is a relatively obscure Jedi Master for people who aren't really well invested in Star Wars lore. So the point is, once these two got a lot of creative control with, The Mandalorian and Book of Boba Fett, right? A lot of the older fans came back, and a lot of the fans were like, yeah, this is pretty good. And I'm pretty sure that a lot of hardcore fans, right, a lot of more casual watchers still enjoyed The Mandalorian. I've seen pretty good reviews of pretty much all of it, and even if the reviews were a little mixed for Book of Boba Fett, I haven't really seen anybody say that it was bad, right? You've got huge division over the primary Star Wars, the new Star Wars trilogy, but I haven't actually seen anybody call the new shows bad in any significant degree. Because it's made by people who care, because it's made by people who really like the series, right? And that's just it. I'm concerned because a lot of studios will kind of blindly be like, okay, what's popular? What's for sale? What can I get, right? And so they'll grab a property, and they'll buy it, and then they'll hand it off to some director who, I'm sure they've got great technical skill, but they might not really be invested in the source material. Now, again, that doesn't mean that it's going to be technically bad. And in fact, it might be alright on occasion. You don't need to just have hardcore fans run everything, but it's really a good idea to have some at the helm. There was one instance specifically that I can think of where some non-fans, some fresh blood, right, actually helped a series, and that was Star Trek. Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, had a bunch of people on the production team who weren't hardcore Star Trek fans, and it actually kind of helped with a nice course correction. Alright, that's okay, but they kept to the rules. They kept to certain sets of rules, and they didn't, break anything, and they kept going. Compare that with more modern Star Trek, for instance, Star Trek Discovery, right? Where Star Trek Discovery makes vague references to a lot of the other shows, but they don't fit. There's a lot of continuity issues, and that really turns off a lot of fans. I mean, like me, I don't like Star Trek Discovery. I love TNG, I love Deep Space Nine. I really love Deep Space Nine. Maybe I'll rant about that at some point, but I don't like Discovery because a lot of the people behind it don't seem to really like Star Trek very much. Contrast that with, and I'm surprised I'm saying this, Lower Decks. Star Trek Lower Decks. I didn't think I'd like that at first. I really didn't. But after the first couple episodes, it gets better and better, and the reason why is because a lot of the people on that writing team really like Star Trek, alright? On Star Trek Discovery, you have maybe a thrown-out line about some race from TNG or Deep Space Nine, and not only does it kind of not fit well, but it's also just wrong sometimes. So for instance, like, oh man, I'm trying to think of a really good example, but the redoing of the Klingons, the complete rewriting of their culture. There was one kind of insulting thing where Alex Kurtzman, the head runner of Star Trek Discovery, said, the Klingons were always kind of depicted as bad guys. They were always kind of depicted as the villain, and we wanted to humanize them. We wanted to add more detail. But that ignores so much of TNG and DS9, which explored their deep culture, which really went into detail. And, with that kind of writing at the helm, it's messed up. But then you look at Lower Decks, and as time goes on, you see a lot of these more obscure things come up. And it's not just references for the sake of references. Sure, there's a little bit of that, like, a picture in the background of Data's daughter, Lal, before she got her, face. Or, random things like that. It's, that's fine every now and then, but a lot of the times they'll tie actual lore stuff into the story, all right? There was a great episode that featured a Klingon ship, a Federation ship, and a Vulcan ship that all ended up in the same place towards the climax of the episode. I don't want to spoil too much beyond that, but all of them told stories that were pretty consistent with what we had seen in TNG and DS9 and the original series. So it's very clear that those writers are, really big fans of Star Trek, and it's nice to see that. That went really well, pretty much. Even fans who are really dedicated to hardcore hating any of the new Star Treks, I mean, they're pretty split on Lower Decks for that reason, because there's actual merit to it. It's written by people who like it. But the biggest example that I have to think of today is Amazon's new Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power show. Now, I've been watching a lot of this, all right? I've been watching quite a bit of this from its inception. And the initial, teaser where they had the molten metal pouring down through the molds, that looked pretty cool. I didn't know much about the series, but, I've been a kind of soft fan of Tolkien, right? I can't say that I've sat through the Silmarillion or anything like that, but I would read through articles, I would read through information about the lore, about the setting, because I thought it was so cool, and he built an amazing world. In fact, I've been listening back through The Hobbit recently because, I'm like, well, I mean, this is fresh on my mind, I want to listen to it. But the problem is, Amazon bought the rights to The Lord of the Rings, right? And they were like, okay, this is a big series, a lot of people know the name, and they put a bunch of writers and showrunners on it who frankly didn't get it, or rather, a lot of them don't seem to care about Tolkien's work. For instance, all right? If I were Amazon and I just acquired the rights to The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings trilogy, because those are the only things they have the rights to, they don't have the rights to anything else Tolkien wrote. That'll become important later. If I were that Amazon executive, I'd go, okay, there's no way we could live up to the Lord of the Rings trilogy that Peter Jackson made, all right? Fans would always be comparing us to them and be disappointed, but we might be able to do The Hobbit. We might be able to remake The Hobbit as a show, because there were some really mixed reviews on that that set of movies, and then we can kind of make our own series for it and take our time. We have the rights to it. Let's hire a couple of Tolkien scholars, because that's a thing, like professional scholars who just study Tolkien. It's great. We'll hire a couple of them. Obviously, we have to have the accredited writers. We have to have the there are certain pressures on a studio to have a certain, they have certain quotas for, like, okay, you have to have writers from this either union or guild, you have to have, this many actors from these groups, you have to have, all of these people need to be accredited through this institution, and then it gets a little crazy. So I understand there's a lot of pressure on the back end, but that doesn't mean that you can't have, your writers, checked by some people who actually know a lot about what's going on. Where am I going with this? Where I'm going with this is, that's not what they did. They didn't take it and go, what can we do? What can we kind of redo with the rights that we have? And how can we both appeal to old fans and also bring in new ones, all right? Think about The Mandalorian again, right? You can appeal to old fans and, really get them in. And there's a lot of Tolkien fans. If you appeal to the fans, you will get millions of views and probably a lot of money. But, not just appeal to them, but also to new audiences through your writing, through all that kind of stuff. Cinematography, music. One of the only good things I've heard about this new series, by the way, is Howard Shore's coming back for the music. So that's nice. I'm just sorry he's caught up in all this. So, anyway, where am I going with this? That's not what Amazon did. Amazon instead decided that they were going to, I suppose in an effort to try and get more creative freedom, make a prequel to The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. And that's their new show, Rings of Power. Which, on paper, might have sounded really good to them because, hey, we don't have to stick within the confines of the books and we can still kind of write whatever we want while cashing in on the name. I'm sure that's what they thought, except Tolkien wrote a prequel. It's called The Silmarillion, and it goes into explicit detail of all of the things that happened in the time period in which they've just set their new show. On top of that, they don't have the rights to anything else that he wrote, including the unfinished tales or, any of his letters or anything like that. So they are going in, and by definition, they will be contradicting Tolkien's lore, which, if you're a Lord of the Rings fan, a longtime fan, you don't do that. Tolkien himself was very, very, very adamant about the way his world was, and he had very specific rules about writing stories in his world. And they are breaking those rules, which is a really bad move. Now, they released the first trailer, and there's a lot of issues with it, mostly because of that reason, mostly because they're trying to set it in the Second Age, which is covered in the Silmarillion and a couple other things, and it's only really, most of their guidelines are coming from the appendices of Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. Those are their guidelines, and they're allowed to use that, but they're not allowed to use the actual book Tolkien wrote covering the time period they're setting this in, which means they're going to have to make it up, which means they're going to have to defy his lore, which means they're going to have to come up with their own explanations and stories, and that's bad news. That's real bad news, honestly. Because then you're going to mess with all the fans. And, sometime, at this point you might be thinking, well, okay, they're not trying to attract the old fans. They're trying to get a new audience. Well, then why grab Lord of the Rings? From a marketing perspective, when you get a property, one of the benefits of having that property is it kind of comes with its own fan base. When Disney bought Star Wars, they were banking on Star Wars fans coming out and supporting it because, that's a pretty big fan base. And especially once The Mandalorian dropped, that worked great. I like The Mandalorian. I really like The Mandalorian. I freaking love Star Wars. Right? But, you see, Lord of the Rings fans are a little different than most. They tend to be meticulous and very defensive of Tolkien's work, because he was very defensive of his own work, and his son, Christopher Tolkien, was also very defensive of his work. And so when they decided they were just going to kind of make it up and set it in the same setting, but also involve key elements that Tolkien already described and covered, it was a pretty big slap in the face to fans. But moving on, alright, and I have to address this, because if I'm going to talk about the Rings of Power and the backlash, then I have to address it. Amazon seems to be banking on the idea that most fans who don't like it don't like the diversity casting, because they cast, they have very diverse casting. They have at least shown a black elf and a black dwarf. And there are many fans out there who argue, right, that because it is meant to be northern folklore, that they would not have those kinds of skin tones. I personally am not going to weigh in on that. What I am going to weigh in on, though, is detail adjacent to that. I don't really have too much of an issue with, the darker skin tones of some of these characters, but the elf in question, or actually a couple of elves in question, they don't have long hair. And Tolkien was actually pretty specific about elves having long hair. To the same degree, the dwarf lady that they showed, the dwarf woman that they showed in, the trailers and some of the pictures, has no beard. You might be, if you're not a big Tolkien fan, then you might be asking, why would that matter? Well, according to Tolkien, and this is in the books that they own, the male and female dwarves are pretty much indistinguishable from each other. You wouldn't be able to tell by looking at one. One of the Amazon representatives argued that because he didn't outright state that female dwarves have beards in those books, that therefore that's fine, and it's perfectly fine. We don't have to give her a beard, except, well, one, later on it is stated that female dwarves have beards and all of the dwarves are born with facial hair. It's weird. Anyway, but it's also really hard to argue that when the wording is along the lines of male and female dwarves are indistinguishable and beards are such a huge part of their aesthetic. You would pretty much instantly know one. So, from the get-go, there's two details, all right? Short-haired elves and beardless dwarf. On a lot of the front end of their promotional material. And then there's a lot of controversy around Galadriel, right? Galadriel, we saw her in The Lord of the Rings itself, and she was a very, very powerful, stateswoman and mage. She was she was a great leader. She was a great orator, and she had a lot of power. But in Tolkien's actual stories, she was never like a frontline fighter. She was never like the kind to put on armor and grab a sword and go and fight, like that, one-on-one. That wasn't her style, that wasn't her thing. But instead, in the new series, apparently, that's how they're making her. They're making her kind of this Joan of Arc archetype, in armor with the sword, this kind of rough-and-tumble adventurer type. And it really contradicts what Tolkien wrote, So when you combine things like that, it shows that for the details, the writers don't really care, or, even less maliciously, I doubt they decided to look at that and go, well, we're just going to choose not to give the dwarf a beard. I highly doubt that. It's more likely that they just didn't know, but that just means that nobody in the entire process actually looked up, hey, what are female dwarves like? I mean, they must be in this book somewhere. No one did that. No one looked at it and went, hey, this is the way this is supposed to be. But bigger than that, all right? So we've got two primary issues that are opposites of each other. On the small details, like the beards, the hair length, the armor and all that kind of stuff, they don't care. And then on the large scale, the opposite end, right? Not minor details, but major details. They aren't allowed to use the actual lore, for the era in which their new show is set. Which means that overall, they, in broad strokes, they can't write what Tolkien wrote, and they can't use the material that Tolkien wrote. And then in small strokes, they don't care enough about the details. So, effectively, it's just a lot of I don't care. They could have made their own fantasy series. They're Amazon! And if they wanted to make a fantasy series kind of focused on, whatever it is they're going to focus on with this series, they could have. And it probably would have done pretty well. I mean, a lot of the people have compared it to, this is going to be their Game of Thrones, right? They could have made their own Game of Thrones equivalent. They really could have. I mean, think about how many shows have come out from Amazon that people watch pretty regularly, right? They've got a lot. They've got a big service, and they've got the marketing budget to do it. And a lot of people would probably defend it if they marketed it right. But instead, they bought a pre-existing franchise and then staffed it with people who just didn't care about it. And I'm tired of that. In my opinion, because I don't want this rant to be too long. It's already close to 20 minutes. But to wrap this up, if you're going to buy a series, if you're going to write something set in a setting, I really think that the least you can do is read up on it. The least you can do, all right, is to actually have some people on the staff who like it. Have some people on the staff who care. Have some people in the writing room who really, really like this thing. Again, back to Filoni and Favreau. They're huge fanboys. They love Star Wars. They think it's fun. I saw a great joke that, when they're doing storyboarding, they're probably in the back playing with action figures. It's great. It's nice to see fans with technical skill, mind you, fans in the industry, being able to make the things that they love. And this is a big industry, right? And Tolkien has touched millions of lives. You can't tell me that there's no directors out there who, who love Tolkien. You can't tell me that there are no directors out there who just love The Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit and wouldn't jump at this. I mean, they had so many options, and they seem to have just kept consistently making a bunch of things. And then worse than that, oh my gosh, I will address this. They had a video called Superfans React, right? It's like Superfans React to the trailer, but the 4 people they picked, at least for the English one, didn't really know anything about Tolkien. I mean, it sounded like they'd at least watched the Jackson trilogy, but they really... these are supposed to be superfans. I have nothing against any of them specifically, alright? They got invited by a giant corporation to come and see something before everyone else and react to it on screen. That's good for them. I will not endorse going after people like this. I mean, come on. It's a cool opportunity, but I have a problem with Amazon's marketing. They brought on people who really didn't know much about Tolkien beyond maybe the Jackson films, and they called them superfans. Like, the video kind of got ratioed into the ground, so they unlisted it for English, but they're still up for the other languages, and I've been told that based on the translations, the other ones tend to know even less, except for apparently the French one. I've been told that the French superfan video is actually pretty decent, but I haven't seen it. I don't speak French. What I mean to say is, I'm really tired of seeing these big corporations with huge budgets just kind of take something that already exists and then not even bother to deal with it. If you want to take something that already exists, that's great. But make sure that there are people who actually understand it and like it and care for it in the writing room. But if you don't want to go through that effort, then make your own thing. Like, really, make your own thing. It's worked out great for Netflix. Netflix has a lot of shows that are completely original, and it actually worked out pretty good in their favor. Paramount is struggling a little bit with that, but I mean, that's kind of how that goes. They are having to compete with Disney and Netflix, Netflix being the first primary big guy in the market, so, it's kind of hard to dislodge that. And then Disney, who has literally a century plus of content. I mean, honestly, it's rather impressive that Paramount is keeping up. And then, of course, there's HBO Max as well, but the point is, you can make new content, and people will watch it, people will enjoy it, especially if you market it well. Imagine if Amazon had spent the supposedly $1 billion production budget from this show on something of their own creation. You better believe they would have spent millions on advertising. It probably would have gone out there and gone pretty well. And they would have 100% creative freedom without having to worry about really any backlash, except, well, there's people who get mad about anything. But anyway, that's my rant. In short, the TLDR at the end of this rant is, if you're gonna get a property, like Star Wars, like Lord of the Rings, like Star Trek, at least have people who care about it in charge of the project, in charge of the writing, or at the very least, looking over the scripts or looking over the premise or anything like that. Because if you don't, that fan base that was going to be your bread and butter is gonna end up becoming the biggest roadblock to your success. Anyway, that's my rant for the day. And really, thank you for listening to my voice.